Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. This week, I am sharing the second part of the abandoned car process video. Here's a reminder of the Pixabay image that I'm using for this painting and a sketch of where we ended up last week. This week, I'm going to start by adding in colors and also details in two different sessions. Here's a quick look at the colors that I'm using for this painting. I'm just using a standard landscape palette and also using Liquin Original because it helps the paint to dry just a little bit more quickly between applications. I found that using Liquin in very, very small amounts can be very, very helpful as a medium. The first thing that I'm doing is thinking about the colors that are present in the painting and starting to lay down those base colors. Specifically, I'm starting with the background, which is a mix of greens and blues. I try to never use colors straight out of the tube. I always mix various versions, and my goal for this blocking stage is to have 5 different types of green in the background. And so I start simply by mixing a dark green using blue, yellow, cadmium yellow, and an ivory black, and then slowly adding in more yellow and other colors to help lighten up. I believe I also mixed in some ochre. I do not pre-mix colors like many artists do. I try to do most of my mixing on the palette, especially when I'm working in landscapes, because I find that that gives more variation to the various colors that I'm using. So I'm constantly mixing and remixing, and I think that this gives a really nice effect to the finished painting. Before I go too far, I decided to go ahead and establish my trees. I didn't want to completely lose my sketch of the trees as I moved forward, and once I've established just that basic base color for the trees, I go back in and continue to add in the foliage and the leaves. When creating the background effect, I found that I was just really interested in capturing the areas that would be lightest and darkest, thinking about how the light is filtering through the trees onto the car. So in the middle, I have the more light colors where the sun is coming through with a little bit more intensity. And then on the sides, I am bringing in some darker colors. And this should also help to focus the eye towards the focal point of the painting rather than kind of bouncing off the canvas as they view the final painting, or at least that's my hope. I am very mindful of leaving some of the blue patches because I do want to have that effect of the sky in the final painting, but my biggest concern is to just get everything covered up and to get all of those first layers of colors into the painting. You can see here on the foreground, I'm mixing various browns, which is the burnt sienna with yellow ochre, a little bit of red mixed in, and sometimes I'm adding just a little dab of that white to lighten up the color. I try to avoid using too much white at first because it can really overpower the colors and make them look more pastel and less saturated. I'm not so concerned with brush strokes because since this is going to be leaves and various foliage, we're looking for smaller brush strokes. So I'm dabbing the canvas, but I also know that this is just a first layer. It's giving us an indication of the colors that will be used later, and it's just really kind of helping to give an overall feel for what the painting will look like. I do spend a bit more time with the background, but honestly, it is not the focal point of the painting, so you'll see that I spend more time on the car. For the car itself, what was so interesting about the original picture is that We have the bright blues and bright whites and the chrome of the car, but they're also covered in years of debris and years of grime and dirt, and I believe there's even a little bit of moss or algae growing on the car in some places. So I wanted to establish that kind of grimy undercoat as I moved forward with the painting. I found that it was very important as I was putting in these base coats to be mindful of the lines and the proportions. And I had already done a good bit of working out the lines, the proportions, and the composition with the sketch, but I wanted to be careful not to distort too much as I'm laying on those base colors. So you can see here where I'm keeping some of the sections pretty separate at first, because any of you who have painted know when you're painting round things, they tend to get bigger as you try to equal them out. So I wanted to avoid that by staying within specific shapes as I'm painting, if that makes any sense. I also wanted to be sure to start to think about the form of the car itself in terms of the curves and the darks and the lights. I wanted to be sure to put lighter colors where the light would hit or where the car would bend, and darker colors where I wanted it to appear as if that portion of the car was set farther in. So again, I'm going through the palette. I've mixed a blue with white, the Prussian blue, and just a tiny drop of the cadmium red. And this is helping to give this kind of off sky blue. It's almost got a bit of a cooler undertone to it, of course, as a blue, but that little bit of red just saturates it just a little bit, or desaturates it just a little bit. It's also important to consider where light is reflecting, and I start to kind of play with that a little bit in this first level as well. What again is most important to me is keeping those shapes and making sure that the form and the curves of the car come through, which I believe was pretty successful in this first layer. After I've established those base colors, I start to think about the grime and the different colors of the car. If you look in the original picture, there are greens, the reds, browns, a variety of kind of yellowy colors. So we want to mix this all in as we go forward. I like to do this at the base coat stage because the paints are still wet and it allows for better blending. When I move on to the next stage, I actually allow the painting to dry and then come back, and it's more of a glazing when I add in those final details. But it's very helpful to add in these layers of grime when all of the colors can blend together more easily. What I found most challenging about the blocking stage was considering the colors that should be present in the windows. The back window showed the darker forest behind the car, while the front window was reflecting the light from the sky. So I found it a bit of a challenge to decide how bright that front window should be and how much of the yellow and the green and the grime should be on the window. So you'll see that I play with that a little bit as I move forward and as I move through the painting, just kind of adjusting those values. One thing you want to do when you're painting is try to bring up the various portions of the painting together. So You don't want to get super hyper detailed in one painting in one section of the painting before you've addressed another section. So that is one of the reasons why when I block, I try to cover the entire canvas before going back to add details, because as you continue to layer, as you continue to add colors, it's important to adjust, because color theory, the color is going to read differently depending on the colors that are next to it. And this is one of the reasons why I feel it's important to start with the background, because that background is going to set the focal point, which is the car. In this particular painting, it's going to set it into context with the colors. So my blue was a little bit of a darker blue or dingier blue than it might have been if I had started first and made the blue the color of the sky. I hope that makes sense the way that I'm explaining it, but it's really important that we see how all of our colors are working together as we move forward. With my paintings, I don't strive for photorealism. I strive for an interpretation. And with painting, I very much feel it is the journey and the challenge. And so my challenge for this painting was trying to represent as best I could this idea of this abandoned car, which is beautiful, but also forgotten by time a little bit in this piece. And so that was really what I was trying to have come through, rather than an exact replication of the image. And that's what I found most important. So you can see as I go in and as I start blocking, I start to change a few of the elements, the angle of the tire, the headlights I have changed up a little bit. The angle of the bumper is something that I played with, because what makes sense in the picture doesn't always make sense in the painting. So it's important to go through and to edit and to adjust as you move forward. Deciding how far to extend the bumper and how to leave the bumper so that you can also see the roundness of that front fender was a challenge as well. There were a lot of good challenges in this painting, and I feel that we learn best through those challenges. So I just want to be honest with you on where I found most of the issues with the painting as I moved forward. With the license plate, I think I mentioned in the last video that I am still very much not proficient with letters and numbers. So I hadn't decided how much of the license plate was going to be covered up by ivy or small saplings, trees, and leaves. So I've just kind of given it a nice shading to give myself some options as I move forward. Oil painting is actually very forgiving in some respects, because if you let it dry, you can always go back and paint over, and you can often blend out color mistakes as you move forward. So if you're interested in trying oil painting, if you're interested in trying something that goes beyond the alla prima method, where you allow yourself to take time off between sessions, usually I work for 3 to 4 hours, let the painting dry, and then come back, you might be really surprised with how forgiving it is, and how much you can change if needed when you come back to a painting the second time. Often, just like with creative writing, I think we're afraid to make mistakes and make big changes, but once you're willing to kind of get over that hurdle of not wanting to redo or start over or make changes, I think you'll be really impressed with what you can do when you just kind of learn to follow the process. There were many times that I've actually edited out of this painting where I go back and I'm squinting at the image to try to figure out what certain elements are and how certain elements are relating to each other. For example, if you look underneath the headlight that I just filled in there, there is a small circle. And I originally thought that this small circle was something that connected the bumper to the car. But after really kind of investigating and looking at the painting, I realized that it is the headlight which has fallen down. So here's where I am at the end of the blocking stage. The next stage is where I go in and I start to add details. I let the painting dry for about a week using that Liquin, and now I'm going in and starting to build on those colors and those shapes and adding smaller strokes, adding more color and more detail. And this is something I'm still very much learning and getting a feel for. So you can see sometimes I change my mind a little bit in the painting itself, but I find that with each new painting I do, each new session where I'm sitting with a particular painting, I learn to go in and add more details and have started to learn how to edit myself as well, which is something that I think is very important that we do as artists, and especially those of us who are learning and who are somewhat self-taught. A lot of it is just so much trial and error. So don't be afraid to go in and make mistakes. It's just a painting. It's just a piece of canvas, and you can always try again. I have established some of the colors of the trees here. I'm added more red and then some yellow ochres mixed with the red and the brown to give the trees a bit more form and a bit more dimension. I also noticed that with the leaves, I had taken out a little bit too much of the sky, which is no big deal. I just went in and I added a little bit more sky with some blue patches. Painting the leaves was really fun because I experimented with mixing various forms of red and brown, the cadmium yellow, the cadmium red, the yellow ochre, the brown, just kind of mixing them all together in little piles and then dabbing them on. I'm also starting to add more of the vines and the leaves around the car. And what I find is best is using a method where I start with the darkest color and then establish the mid-tone and then hit with the lightest color on the top, as you can see I've done by the tire. What's most important is to think about the light. So where would the light be shining and where would there be more darkness or more shade? And that's usually in a landscape painting, usually at the top of the plant or the element, if the sun is directly above, or we can also give the effect of the sun or the light coming from the side by putting that highlight on the side as well. And I'm going to go back into the trees in a little while and you'll see where I kind of play with that as I'm deciding about the light. I also needed to bring the bushes but behind the car as well and start to clean up the lines of the car. So you'll see that I'm starting to do that. And then, as I mentioned before, since I allowed the painting to dry, I can actually do quite a bit of scrubbing onto the canvas. So I use a bit of a dry brush method, add in those rust colors, and then I'm using either a shop towel or the blending brush to go in and fade out and give more of kind of a patchy, rusted look as I move forward. I wanted to go back in and establish the chrome as well, and it's a little bit too bright now. I probably should have put just a little bit more black or more blue into the white, but I wanted to be sure to go ahead and establish the highlights. I'm doing a lot of blending at this stage to try to replicate the colors that I see in the photo and also be mindful of how colors are reflected in the painting itself. So you'll see that I have blue in the sky. I also have blue in the car. I have more of a blue tone to the grays on the car, and then I'm adding blue into the headlight. I have yellows that are appearing throughout the painting and also some purples. I'll go back in towards the end of the painting and I'll establish a few more purple tones in the trees as well. And this all is very helpful for creating a sense of unity within the painting, using those same kind of colors and having them in the foreground, the midground, and the background as well. The colors will be a bit lighter. This is kind of it all seems a bit closer. It's not like a landscape where you see a mountain in the back and then trees and then the foreground. So the colors can match a little bit more, but normally the back is lighter and the closest to the camera is a bit darker. I'm adding some more white patches in and kind of scrubbing them. You'll see that I'm moving between a paper towel, my finger, and the blender brush. When I really start to get into the details, I actually have several brushes going, and I like to put cooler colors on one brush, warmer colors on another brush, so that I can kind of mix as I go. And so you'll see I've really gotten into the details here, and I'm not paying so much attention to the camera. So I apologize if the paintbrushes in my left hand are blocking the view just a little bit here. Now I'm really starting to go in and establish those fine details, thinking about the door, the hinge of the door, the various shapes, adding in the tracks on the tire, and thinking about bringing those shades back underneath. I've lost some of the dark underneath the car, so I want to be sure to bring that shadow back. I'm also adjusting the roof as I blend out the lines. Some of the best advice that I've received with painting subjects is to not have hard lines defining the different elements, to have a soft line in between. So I always try to go back with the blender brush or with my finger and kind of fade those two lines together. So the car with the forest behind it has a bit of a softer line instead of a harder line like you would see in a cartoon. Again, I'm still playing with that window. I'm adding in leaves, and as I'm using the different colors, anytime I get a new red or a new rust color, I try to kind of go in and drop a few leaves. I will also add some green in just to bring the greens from the other parts of the painting. I noticed that the car was getting a little bit too grungy, and I wanted to go back in and add some more of those bright blues, and then establish the darks on those rust spots throughout the painting as well, just so that they looked very deep, very dark, and so the eye would be drawn to those spots, because I always think that those rust formations on cars, or I guess it's not really a formation, it's where the car is rusted away. I think that those shapes are very, very beautiful on these old abandoned vehicles. I actually got up early to work on this painting. I think I started about 4 a.m. on this third session, so you can see the sun is coming up from the window behind me and casting a shadow here as I'm working. I didn't notice that while I was working, so I thought that was really neat. Whenever possible, I recommend using natural lighting for your painting. I use a ring light that has a natural light setting, but I really enjoy also working during the day, because I think that that gives you a better idea of what your colors look like. At this point, I am just adding in those final details, being sure to look and double check the picture, double check the painting, thinking about the proportions, standing up, looking at the painting from across the room, or taking a photo works well as well, so you can see your painting from a different perspective. And here is where I ended up. I was very pleased with this process. I was pleased with the challenge and what I learned. And I really hope that this video was helpful to you, and that you try to copy a photograph as well. Thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to our next session.